Welcome to part 2. If you skip the UI part, look for the link in the description. That will give you the full UI ready to build with Clerk and Hasura. If you followed along, you can use the exact same code that we started in part 1. Now, before we get started, let's talk about what we're going to do. First, we're going to sign up for a Clerk account. If you haven't done that, go and do it right now. Pause the video, go and do it. Secondly, sign up for a Hasura account, link in the description as well. Make sure that's done before you start this course. So we're going to create a new application in Clerk. Then we're also going to create our new Hasura database, and I'm going to show you how all of that works behind the scenes, including setting up every single part of that. The tables, the delete, the inserts, and we're going to do some of the queries there from the beginning. Then I'm going to show you how to integrate Clerk into your application, and then I'm going to show you how to integrate Clerk and Hasura together. Then by the end of the course, you'll have this deployable application using Clerk and Hasura. I'm going to show you how to deploy to production using Clerk, and then I'm going to show you what you need to update in Hasura to allow it to work correctly. Now, once everything is working together, you'll have a fully deployed application that you can use. Obviously, you don't have to deploy an application if you don't want to. One thing to note is, with Clerk, you are required to have a real domain before you deploy. You cannot use something like forsales.app. It has to be a real version of a domain, like jamesperkins.dev or something similar. Now I've talked about that, let's get in and start digging around and looking at how this all works together. Welcome to Clerk's dashboard. If you've never used this before, it is a very UI friendly way to create user authentication and authorization for things as you go along. So I'm going to create an application here. So click create application, and we're going to choose standard setup because we don't actually want this. So click continue here and give the application a name. So we're going to call this our next to do application. And let's give it a brand color as well. I like something in the purples, and hit create. So that is now set up our to-do application, and we have these development options here that give us all sorts of front end and URLs that we can use, as well as if we had any users, we'd be able to see them here. And what we're going to be working on in a minute is this integration to Hasura. But first, we need to set up Hasura before we can get going. So log into your Hasura account, and what you should see is this project screen. Click New Project, click Free Tier, and give the project a name. So we'll also call this Next To Do App, and hit Create Project. And then it will create this project and start initializing. So once it's done initializing, I'll meet you back here, and we can start talking about how to set this up. So now this is finished provisioning and getting set up, you want to click this Launch Console button that will give us the ability to start creating databases and things like that, as well as permissions, etc. So it's going to give you this little pop-up. Just go ahead and click Don't Show Me Again, and then we are good to go. So what you want to do is select Data. So once you hit this screen, you're going to click Connect Database, and you're going to get this option to select either create an existing one or create a Heroku database. If you click this and then click Heroku, it will make a Postgres database for us to use with Hasura. Keep it awake and do all those things that we need so that we can have a free tier, making it really great for this kind of work. So now we have this database over here on the left-hand side. You'll notice that there are no tables currently. So what we can do is click Create Table, and it's going to ask you for all sorts of information, such as table name, columns, primary keys, foreign keys, unique keys, check constraints, and a comment. So let's start by working on that. So we're going to give the table name of to-dos, and then we're going to have a column name here. And if you click this button, it's one of my favorite buttons, it will give you an option to select something. And we want this UUID primary key generated here. It's non-nullable, and it will give you a unique one every time. Then we need a title, and we'll give that a column type of text, and the default value will be nothing. Then I need a completed version, and we'll give this a Boolean. And the default value here is going to be false. It's never going to be completed until we tell it otherwise. Then we're going to say we need a created at timestamp. So to do that, you can do timestamp, and we'll do it with time zones. So just timestamp, and then we want a default value to be now. And that will just fill in immediately when someone creates it. It will be the date and time as of right this very second. Then we need an updated at version. That will also be a timestamp. And that will also be now by default. And then the column name will be user ID. And that will be text. And then the note itself, which will also be text. So those are all the columns that we're going to need to make this work. And then we're going to ask for a primary key, and it's going to be ID, which we've already set from here. It's going to ask for any of these unique keys, and then any triggers or constraints, but we don't need those right now. So go ahead and hit add table. And now the table is successfully created. You'll get pushed back into this screen right here. And then we can do things like permissioning and relationships, modify this if we need to. We can look at the rows if there were any. So let's work on permissions. Now the way permissions are going to work is we're going to have a user. And the user is going to be the person that we want to be able to insert, select, update, and delete each of these kinds of things. So for the insert, we're going to say without any checks here, but we want them to be able to insert some things. So what we want them to be able to insert is just the title and the note themselves. And then the column presets here, we're going to say column name, user ID. We're going to set it from session variable, and then we're going to use this, the user ID. So you just do user-ID. And that will give us the user ID that is currently logged into a session, which makes it really easy for us to basically say, oh, yep, this person has inserted this user ID column, and we can hit save. So now we've done that, we want the next one to be the select method. So for selecting, we want them to be able to select all of the options here. So we can say, without any with a custom check. So we actually need a custom check here. So the reason we need a custom check is I want to be able to tell the user only you are allowed to select your own items. So the way to do that is to select this and select user ID is equal to this. So if you select this, it'll fill it in for you. And then we want them to be able to select anything they want, and we can hit save. So now we have insert and select done. Now we need update done. Now the way update's going to work is we want the same custom check as selects. Like we only want them to be able to update one of their own, so we can select that. And then we only want them to be able to update two columns here. The completed date, the completed and the updated at. And the preset for the updated at will be static, and it will be now. So if you just type now and then this set of parentheses and hit save permission, it will update it to right this second as of the update. Then we need to be able to delete, right? Like if we want our user to be able to delete, and the only thing that we have here is we need this to be the same, and then you hit save permissions, and now all of our user provisioning is done. It took us about 5 or 6 minutes to get this all done. We now have the ability to insert and do all sorts of things as we so wish with our front end UI. But how do we get Chakra UI to talk to Hasura? Well, that's actually fairly simple. At least Clerk has done a great job of making it that way. If you go back to your dashboard, under integrations, if you click this button, it will say, hey, integration settings are saved. Now we have Hasura integration. But how does it know which Hasura integration to use? Well, we need to update one piece of the file to make this work the way that we want, so that we know this version of our application is talking to Hasura. So the way this works is you click this button right here, the little cogwheel, go to nvars, and you're going to click add new var, and you're going to type JWT, and it's this JWT secret. And the way that it works is this is a JSON, so we'll just put something there, and this is what we're looking for. This is HTTPS, our front-end API, and then something else. So the front-end API comes from your instant configuration, which is under the Home tab right here. And what we need is to set this to JWK URL in a JSON. So we can do this, and then this, and then that should work, and allowing us to be able to handle all of our settings here in our Hasura instance. So when you click add, you should be good to go. So it's JWK underscore URL, and then the URL that we provided, which is found under your instant configuration. So now we have a Hasura database that's ready to go. We have Clerk that's integrated with Hasura, but we don't actually know how to set up Clerk or use it in our application, which is where we're at now. We're actually at the coding stage of this whole thing. So let's start coding and getting this working with Hasura and Clerk. So here we are in the application that we created in the first scene. And now we need to start adding more packages that we're going to need to make this work. So we need to install a few packages. So it's yarn add, and we need @clerk/clerk react. We're also going to use Apollo for this. So Apollo/client. And we also need GraphQL. So we'll install all three of those. And once that's done, I'll meet you back here. So all those packages have fully installed now, and we are ready to go here. What we need to do first is really work on a few pages that we need from Clerk, and then we need to update our app.js, as well as creating a provider from Apollo. So let's start with the Apollo client first, because that is quite a bit of work, and we're also going to do some caching right out of the box. So in our project here, we're going to create a new folder called utils. And inside of this utils, we're going to create something called Apollo client.js. And inside of here, we're going to import some Apollo features. So Apollo client, Apollo provider from HTTP link and in-memory cache. Now this in-memory cache is going to help us out in the future, so it's important that we use it from the start. So we're going to do from, and that's from @Apollo/client. Then we need to import set context, and that's going to come from @Apollo/client/link/context. And we're also going to import something called use user from @Clerk/Clerk React. Now the way use user works, essentially it looks to make sure there's an actual user, and then it can provide tokens back and forth for Hasura. So we need to know where we're sending this data. So we're going to have something called Hasura GraphQL API, and we're going to equal that to process.env.next underscore public underscore Hasura underscore graph QL API. And you're probably asking, well, we don't have this right now, so let's make an env.local. And let's put one of these in there. And you're probably asking, where do I get this from? Well, you get it from Hasura, and I'll show you quickly where to get that. If you go to your projects and go to General, you'll see that there is this GraphQL API. Copy that, and then just drop it in your environmentals, and you're good to go. So I'm going to create this provider before we've set up Clerk, but I will explain as we go along the small piece that we're using from Clerk. So what we're going to do here is an export const, and we're going to call this Apollo provider wrapper. Personally, I like Little Wayne, but each to their own. And then it's children. And then inside of here, we're going to use something called user. So basically, we're saying we want to create a user. So const user equals use user. So we're saying, hey, we want the user that's currently logged in. And we want the middleware token. So we can create something called auth middleware. And set that equal to set context. And we can make an async request here. So async rec, comma, headers. And then from here, we can do a function and say const token equals await user. So we're going to get the user and get token Hasura. So we're basically saying here, we want the Hasura token. Now, if you were using a different integration like Firebase, which you may have seen my previous videos on, this may seem quite familiar because you could put in Firebase here instead. Then we can do return. And what we want returned is the headers. And inside of that headers, we want dot. So we're going to spread the headers. And then authorization, a bearer token. So bearer, $, token. And that will give us our middleware that we might need. Then we need to create something called an HTTP link. So the way that this works is we basically create a connection to our Hasura GraphQL. So you just type in URI Hasura GraphQL API. So that gives us that part. Then we're actually going to make our Apollo client now that we can use throughout our application. Now in here, we're going to make something called cache. And that cache is going to handle what happens if we try and merge some stuff together and make our app much faster. So if you've never worked with cache before, we're going to go through this quite slowly so that we make sure we understand what's happening. So first you need to create your Apollo client. Then you need to create the link. Now the link is from auth middleware, which is this section right here. And then our HTTP link right here. So now we have the link. Now we're going to set our cache policy here. Now this cache is going to make it really, really easy to essentially assume that things are going to work, and we can just provide the data really quickly and sort of merge a request together, making our API requests much faster. So you do that, you do new, and we're using in-memory cache. So in-memory cache. And then inside of our memory cache here, you're going to do type policies. So this is how we tell what kind of policies we want. And we're going to use query. Now, query is basically exactly what it sounds like. It's when we make a query. We're going to look for fields. And those fields are to-dos, which is what we called the database. and we're going to tell it merge false, which means we're basically going to say whatever gets returned from the database, just we assume that everything is fine. And then if we hit save here, this now should be ready for us to use. And then all we need to do is do our return function. So we're going to return here and say Apollo provider client equals this Apollo client. And then children go in here. And now this is ready to be used wherever we need it, and we're going to wrap our whole app in this in a second. But let's just talk about this section one more time, because this part is quite important. So I'm using in-memory cache here, and we're using a policy that says to-dos, we just want to discard whatever we have currently and merge in whatever is there. And the reason behind this is I want to be able to, when someone clicks add, immediately show that new to-do. Now, if we didn't do this, it wouldn't immediately show up for the user, and they would be confused about, I just added a new to-do and nothing has changed, because we're not making a new client request. So we're going to use this to aid in that request. So now we have this, we should really build out our pages that we need for Clerk. So we're going to create a few pages under this pages section. So we're going to have a new folder here, and we're going to call this one sign-in. We're going to create another folder, and we're going to call this one sign-up. And we're going to have a new folder here called user. And that is all we need. Now, each one of these is a self-mounted component, and the way that they work is we're going to pass it in a new file here, and we're going to put 2 sets of square brackets, and then a spreader, and then index. And then the same on the other side. And this means that literally anything that has the word sign in, this is where it will go. And we need to do the same here. So let's just copy this and paste it here. And again, in this user structure as well. So now we have all 3 of these. So for our sign in, all you're going to do for sign in is do import sign in from @clerk/clerk react. And then const sign in page equal to sign in path / equals the path that we want. So this is our path, sign in, and then routing equals path. And then we just, and then somewhere, there we go. We're going to export default sign in page. Now we have this available. Now we need to do sign up and user. So if we copy this sign in page and drop it in a sign up, change this to sign up, change this word to sign up, and this word to sign up, change our path to sign up, and then make sure this matches and hit save. Then the only other one we have is user, and this is like your user profile that Clerk handles. So we can probably copy and paste this one more time and set this to user profile. And then we'll call this user profile page, set this to this, and then this will be /user. And then we'll set this to user profile page. And like that, now we kind of have Clerk integration as well. So now we need to really update our app.js to essentially handle everything that we want. So the way that this works is we're going to wrap everything in the Clerk provider, and then inside of that Clerk provider, we're going to wrap particular pages in the Apollo provider wrapper. So we want to wrap the Apollo provider when they're signed in, and when they're not signed in, we want to essentially redirect them back to the sign-in page. So, in our app.js, let's import some stuff. So, we're going to import Clerk provider. We're also going to redirect to sign in, signed in, signed out from @Clerk / Clerk React. Then we need to import Apollo provider wrapper, and that's what we created from utils / Apollo client. And finally, we need to use router. So use router from next / router. And then we have everything that we need here. Now, the power of Clerk means that we can actually set which pages are public and which ones are not. So we actually don't have any public pages. It's set from 2. And those public pages are going to be in an array, and they're going to be /sign_in / index. So we're using the same as what this is right here. And then we need the sign up version. So we can do a comma here, and then we'll just copy this and paste it here and change this to sign up and hit save. So now we have public pages. So how does this all kind of work together? Well, first in our function, we need to call on router. So we'll do router equals use router and then hit save. So now what we need to do is set underneath our chakra provider, we need to set something called the clerk provider. So you can do clerk provider, and then we're going to need something called front end API, and that's going to be equal to, and we'll do process env next _public _clerk front end API. And we don't have this yet, but we'll get it in a second. And then we need something called navigate, and we're going to say navigate to, and then router.push to. And then we have this clerk provider, which we need to wrap around everything. So cut it from there and drop it under your page shell and hit save. Now we need this. So where do we get this from? So if you go back to your page here and go to your Clerk dashboard, under home, under instant configurations, you'll find this front-end API. Copy that and drop it in your process.env. So now you've added your process.env, we need to do some work here. So inside of here, we're going to do some conditions, and we're going to say public pages.includes. So we're asking if this includes router.pathname. So if it includes anything that's in our router path name, then we're going to render it for them. So we can take this components here and say, go ahead and render that. And that's only if it is available, or we need to do something else. And in this condition part here, we're going to say we need a fragment. And inside of here, we're going to say if they're signed in, so signed in, we're going to wrap it in the Apollo provider wrapper. And then we're going to have this part here, like the page shell and the component props. So we can copy this and drop it in here like this. And then we can hit, let's just tab this so we understand where we're at. And then we tab one more, and tab one more. Okay, so if we're signed in, we want them to be able to essentially show them everything that we have. However, if they're signed out, so we can use the signed out functionality that we imported, we can redirect to sign in. And we forgot to spell it correctly. We need sign in. There we go. And hit save. Okay. So at this point, we don't actually need any of this. We can delete this section here, hit save, and now we have a fully functioning wrapped application that uses Clerk. So now what? Well, first we should test this. So let's go ahead and launch our application and see what happens. So I've launched it and we've come to this screen here, which basically tells me I need to sign in. So if I click this sign in button, select an account, it will sign me in. And there we go. Our application is working in the background. So now we have that. One thing that I want to change before we go any further is it's not currently using self-mounted components. It's just using the regular ones that are hosted by Clerk. So to fix that, go to clerk.dev and go to your dashboard and select your application, and under settings of your development account, under settings here, there's a URL and redirects, and you can set these custom ones to a custom URL. And so for this, I want to set this to localhost 3000 sign up. And then I'm going to set sign in to the same. And then the user profile to user. And that should handle all of our options here for when we have a redirect. And the only other one is the sign out after redirect here. I actually want to set this to sign in. Hit apply changes. And now we have these custom self-mounted components. So the way that that works is if I go ahead and quit out of this and relaunch, what will happen is it will ask me to log in to the local version versus going off to their own stuff. But right now we can't really see that, but we'll work on that in the future. So now I'm logged in as a user. The first thing I want to do is be able to add something over here to say, hey, you're a user and you're logged in. Like you want to manage your account, you want to log out, anything like that. So let's work on that first. Okay, so we have split the code 50-50 so that we can see changes as we make them. So the first thing I want to do is make changes to something called the page shell, which is under our component sections, under layout, called page shell. And what we want to do is underneath this desktop, we want to add something here. So first, let me word wrap this so that you can see everything on screen. And let's start by importing what we need. So we're going to import user button, and that's going to come from @clerk/clerk react. And if I could spell the word import, we would be in a better spot. Now I'm going to take this and I'm going to hit save. And we're going to put it right underneath here in the flex. So we can do this and say user button, user profile URL equal to /user. And that's going to take us to that user section. And then after sign out, all equal to /. And that will take us back to the home page. So if I hit save now, you'll see that this has now appeared. And it has my picture on there, and it says, hey, James. And it has my email address, and I can click sign out. And it will take you back to the sign in page. And then I can log back in again. And we're good to go. Here we are again. We're back on the page. So now we have that functionality working. What's next? Well, now we actually need to work on making queries to our pages, right? Like we need a bunch of queries that we're going to need to have to write. And those queries are going to include things like get all of our to-dos, add a to-do, complete a to-do, remove a to-do, and then get all of the completed to-dos. So first we need to think about where we're going to actually put this work. So I've created quite a lot of work here, and we have things like to-do, And we have add, completed, delete, to do, to-dos. So our to-do section here, which is this piece of code right here, which is a simple component here that just takes in some sort of property and returns something else. In here is where we're going to make a request, and that is going to be for completing the to-do. So when you select it, it will complete the to-do for us. And we'll also use some caching to sort of work that out. In our index page, we're not going to do any of the work there. So like, we're not going to have to worry about doing anything in here. What we do want to do is do something to allow us to grab all of that data. So in the to-dos one, that's where we're going to get our to-dos. In the to-do, which is a singularity version, we're going to update our to-dos. In our delete to-dos, we're going to do our delete request. The completed to-dos, we're going to fill that with all of our completed to-dos. And finally, our add is where we're going to add some to-dos. So I think the first and easiest one to do first would be our add to-do. And because we're not going to really change the UI too much, I'm going to full screen this for now, and then we can come back in a second. So let's full screen and look at our to-dos. So we need to update this code first. It has some stuff, but we really need things like value tracking, on-change handlers, what happens when they click this button, etc. So inside of here, we're going to create some state management first. So there's a few pieces of state management I want. First, I want the ability to track a title. So let's do title and set title and equal that to use state, which we need to import at the top, and we'll make it an empty string. So let's add use state first. So import use state from React, and then hit save. And then I want another one called underneath called note, and then set note. And finally, I want one more, which is loading. So we'll set this to loading and set loading. And we're going to set the state originally to false. So now I have this. Let's talk about our button. Now, our button itself right now is just a type of submit, and it doesn't really do anything. So I want to do two things. Is loading. And I want to set that to that state of loading. And that will give us the ability to essentially know when we are loading and when we are not. And then I want the ability to disable this button if a user does not have a title and does not have a note. So they have to have both of those for us to be able to do something. So if we just wrap this up a little bit to make it a bit better. If I shrink this back down, and now we look at this section, the add to-dos. First of all, this is fine. And as you can see, this is not updating, but it is disabled. So one part of it is working as expected. So now let's update our inputs. So the inputs itself, they have placeholders, but they don't actually have any values. So the way we can do this is say value is equal to note. Oh, this is title, so title. And then value is equal to note. Great. But now I can't actually type in the box. That's a bit frustrating. So now we need to handle title changes and note changes. So the way we can do that is say const handle title change, and then we say equal to event, and then that's going to be equal to set title, and then event target dot value. And then if we take this line here, copy and paste it down here, we can set this and say handle note change. And then we just set this to set note. And then that handles both of those. And what we can do is just add in a onChange handler to handle the inputs. So we can just say onChange equal to, and this one is the note. So we can say handle note change and hit save. And then on this one, we can do another one and say handle title change. Hit save. Now we should be able to type in these, no problem. And as you can see, if we have something in here, they work. This should be an OR statement. There we go. And then if we have both, it is enabled. Great. So now we have the ability to handle the state and track all of the state in this piece of code right here. Then we also have the ability to handle the changes, which is right here. And the only thing really left to do is to actually do a submit. But we don't actually know what the query is going to be until we write our own queries. So we're actually going to create one more folder here. And this folder is going to be called lib. And inside of this lib folder is where we're going to write every single query that we use throughout this app. So we can just do the word queries.js. And inside of here is where we're going to do everything. So let's just hit save on that. And this is where we're going to write queries. Now you're probably asking, like, how do I make a query from what we have? So let's move back over to our Hasura instance and I'll show you how to write a query in their client side. So I've logged into my Hasura instance and now we are at the API screen, which is where we're going to be making our API calls. So first thing you want to do is make sure there's no variables or queries here. And then we're going to set mutation as our option because we want to make a mutation of some sort to essentially mutate by adding a to-do, which is an insert. So we can select insert to-do 1. So this button here. And it will say, okay, I'm going to insert a to-do 1 here. And it's going to say mutation by mutation. So let's call this something else. So we'll call this add to do. So that we have a nice name. And what we're going to do is we need to insert a title and a note. Well, how does that work with mutations? So what we can do here is say, I want to have a title, which should be a string, and also a note that is also a string. So mutation, add mutation, I'm going to use this title and this note somewhere in this. So we have this object here, and inside of the object, we're going to write the word title. And we're going to say, I want $title to be here. And then note as $note. And then what I want returned from you is I want to be able to return something in here. So inside of here, I want to return something. So I'm going to return the ID, the title, and the note. And that should give us the ability to insert something into our database. So let's copy this and let's go back to our code. And back in our queries here, we're going to do an export const. We're going to call this add underscore to do. I'm going to say GQL and then paste. And then close out with another backtick there. Now you're probably thinking, what is this GQL? Like, I don't understand. What do we use that for? So we're going to import GQL, and that's going to come from Apollo. And that's a way for us to be able to make these GraphQL requests on behalf of somebody else. So it's export const add to do equal to this GraphQL mutation. Now if I hit save here, nothing's going to change, but now we can actually make changes to this add to do. So we have a button here And we need to know essentially what to do. So if we go to our add to do section and we think about what we want to do, well, first we need to import add to do's. So import add underscore to do from /lib/queries. And that will use the add to do that we just created in our query section. But now we need to actually use it. So my favorite thing about Apollo is it gives you the ability to do some really neat things. So we need to also import use mutation. So import use mutation from @Apollo/client. And now we're ready to go. So we can create a constant here. And the way that this works is we can call it const, and then we use a set of square brackets and say add to do. And then we set that equal to use mutation. So we're using this. And then we can set it to add underscore to do, which is actually the mutation itself. We can say comma, and then we can handle whatever we want. So we can say on completed. So when it's done, and we know it's successful, we want to set note to nothing. We want to set title to nothing. And we're also going to set loading back to false because I'm going to set it to true in a second. So now we sort of have this query that we can sort of make requests from. We need to make an on submit. So the way that this works is it's essentially just a regular on submit, and then we're going to remake a request using variables, and that will do the add to do section. So you can do this const on submit. Nothing different about that. We'll put an E in here, and then we'll do e.prevent default. And above that, we'll set loading equal to true. So now we know it's loading. And we have this e-prevent default to stop it from doing any of the default submit. And then we can do add to do, which uses this right here. And then we're going to say, hey, variables. What are our variables? Well, we have a title and a note. And that's it. Now we can make a submit. So how do we use this? Well, we just go to our form, which is down here, and we say on submit equal to on submit. And we hit save. Now if we go back here and go to localhost 3000, let's see what happens. Testing 1 2 3. Test. Can you hear me? Add to do. You can see the loading spinner and then it disappeared. So if we go to here and we go to our data service layer, select the to-dos database. Oh, look, we have a piece of data. It has a title. And it has everything that we possibly could want. Note, test, can you hear me? The user that did it, the time it was updated, the time it was created, false testing ID. One problem is that, well, first we don't have a query that queries the data, so we don't actually know if it's any good. So now we should work on making this actual query data versus what it was before. So let's start working on querying data. Now, I'll do it in here first to show you how to use the API. So let's kill this, and then you'll get my queries right out of the gate. And to get the query, what we want to do is say to-dos where completed equals false. So we want all the ones that aren't completed. And what do we want returned? Well, I'll tell you. I want the ID. I want the ID. I want completed. I want note. I want title. And I want the created at date. And that is the query that we're going to use to make our query. And we'll just name it to Get Todos. So let's copy this. Go back to our code here. Make it full screen again so we can all see. And go to our queries and make another one here called export const get todos equal to GQL and then whatever the query might be. And then remember that this query actually has some restrictions on it. So not everyone can query everyone's data, only the person that's logged in can query their own. So now we need to update a few things. We need to update this page and this section of the to-dos and actually the to-dos themselves. So let's look at to-dos first. So what we want to do with to-dos is we want to import use query, which is from Apollo /client, and we want to import get underscore to-dos from /lib/queries, and that will give us the ability to query the data. Then we're going to do a client-side request here. So we can do const loading error and data and say equal use query and then say get to-dos. Now this is what I really like about how the query system works. Now we can do something like if loading return loading ... And then otherwise we can just do if error return div and then the error. Certainly not production ready, but it will do in our case. Then what we can do is say, okay, we know that maybe something has come back, but maybe nothing comes back. So we want to do data question mark dot to-dos question mark dot map to do, and then inside of here is where we can return to-dos. So take this, drop it in here, and we can say based upon this we can pass in some data. So we know we're going to have a key here, and that key is probably going to be a to-do.id. And then we can pass in the rest of the to-do to the item. And now this gives us the ability to continuously draw these on depending on this query. So if we hit save, we need to now update this part. So first let's wrap this so that we can see what's happening and look at how our to-do should be done. So the value here, we first need to actually push something in here. So we can push in to-do and say value is equal to to-do.id. The on change we don't have right now, so we're just going to leave that as is. The ID will be the same as the value, so we can just drop that in here. The title will be the to-do.title. And then the note will be to-do.note. So to-do.note. And hit save. Now, if we stretch this across the screen and drop it off over here, open up our local host, you'll see it's loading, and now we're getting the data back. Testing 1, 2, 3, test, test, can you hear me? If I select this, nothing happens. If I click this, nothing happens. But what happens if we add another one, right? Let's say James's course is great. So much info. okay, nothing happened. We know that it got added, but nothing actually happens. And that's because there's something in here that we need to really kind of fix. And that's something called caching, which we talked about originally. What we're going to do is do something that just assumes that the update is good. Because I'm assuming that this code is never going to break. And the reason behind this is the query is so simplistic in nature, and there are a lot of variables that need to be addressed, that we can assume, using good nature, that this query is going to be fine. So let's do something about that. If I go to the Add To Do section, we have this query here that essentially takes care of the mutation and everything else that comes along with it. So right here we have this Add To Do, and it just has some variables in it. Well, what we can do is import the query here, so get underscore to-dos, and we can use this in this query. And this is where caching comes in. So we can say, go ahead and add this to-do, and let's make this full screen for now, and say add to-do, and here are some variables. Then, once the variables have been added, we can do something called update. An update is going to take cache and say data, and this will all make sense in a second. We're going to say const existing to-dos equals cache dot read query get to-dos. And that will essentially say, hey, I want you to get this cache of this query and go ahead and read it. Then right underneath that, we can do cache dot write query and say query is get underscore to-dos, and data is to-dos, so the to-dos, data dot insert to-dos underscore one dot 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 existing to-dos dot to-dos. And you might be asking, what does all of that mean? Like, this is fairly complicated. So what we're doing is we're taking the cache of this query, which is the get to-dos. And then what we're saying is, hey, let's quickly update that by taking the data that we're inserting, which is what we're passing in, these variables, and add that to our already existing to-dos. And then what should happen now is when we update, we should get a completed to-do, and it gets added to the bottom. So let's minimize this screen and full screen this and say, okay, I want to add another to-do and say superstars aren't born in a day. Yes, let's become superstars, and hit add to-do. And as you can see, immediately the old one came and that brand new one came. So now we have like this instant feedback. As soon as you add a note, it's there. And now we can use that kind of same theory to do the completed versions and the deleted versions. So let's work on deleting before we do completing. So let's minimize this again and pull up our code and say, let's do the delete section now. The delete to do is essentially going to do one thing, which is this on-click handler here, and we're going to handle it for us. So inside of here, we need to do a new query, and the query is going to be remove to do. So let's make that query happen. And this time we're just going to write this query out, because this query in theory is one that you should get used to using if you've never used GraphQL before. So it's remove underscore to do. That's what we're going to call it, which has no bearing on the actual query. So we're going to do GQL And then we're going to write our query here. So we are going to write a mutation, and we're going to call it remove to do. And what we're going to do is we're going to pass in an ID, which is the UUID. And we're going to say delete underscore to-dos by primary key ID $ID, and then we're going to return the ID. So what we're doing here is essentially saying, hey, when we remove an ID, we're just going to find the primary key that matches the ID passed in, and let's just delete it. So we can use this remove in here now. So we're also going to get the get to-dos at the same time. So import get underscore to-dos and then remove underscore to-do from //lib/queries and hit save. And let's just make sure that we exported this out, which we did. We can say const remove to-do mutation. So that's what we're going to use, but we need to import mutation as well. So import use mutation from Apollo /client. So we're going to do const and then open a square bracket and say remove to do mutation. And we're going to say equals u mutation and then set it to remove to do. And then what exactly are we doing with this remove to do, right? So first, let's make this on click. Let's call this remove to do. And then we can do the remove to do in this section. So what we're going to do is call it const remove to do, set it to an E, and say prevent default out of the gate so that we don't get anything funky happen. Then what we're going to say is remove to do mutation. So this function right here, we want to use the remove to do and say the variables are going to be the ID of this button, which is the value right here. So we can just say ID is equal to value.id. And then there's this thing called optimistic response. And the way optimistic response works is that we're just going to assume this mutation's going to work. Like, it's totally fine. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about Apollo. I'm telling you it's going to work. So we can do that by doing this. Optimistic response. And I like to use these on delete functionality because it really gives you that... in theory, this will never fail unless there's no ID. And in theory, there's never going to be a part where there's never not an ID. So then we can do an update statement similar to before where we use the cache to make this really fast. So what we do here is do const data equals cache.read query and say query get underscore to-dos. So get these to-dos. Then we're going to do something called to-dos and say data.to-dos filter. And then we're going to filter that on the ID and say if the ID does not equal value.id, and then we can just do a cache.write query and set the query equal to get to-dos and then the data equal to to-dos. Okay, that was a lot, right? That felt like a lot. So let's talk about it. So what we're doing again is saying, hey, go ahead and just delete this. Remove it from this query. We don't care about it anymore. The variable is going to be the value that we're passing in's ID. We're saying we're super optimistic this is always going to work. So optimistic response, please. And then we're saying, hey, let's update the cache that we have. Get the to-dos. and then say, if this ID equals it, just remove it out. So basically, we're filtering down to the only ones that appear in this response is everything but the one we're deleting. Then we return that, and now what should happen is when we do a delete, we should see the screen update, but the one that's removed is the one that disappears, and everything just continues on. So let's try that out real quick. So here we have 3 different ones. Let's try this one. And boom, it's gone. It's gone from our query. And if we refresh the page, you'll find that only 2 remain, and that is a fresh query. So we know that now deletes are working really well. So what about completing them? Like, that's the last piece to this puzzle, really. We need to be able to complete them. And once they're completed, we also want to show them off on this completed screen that currently doesn't show anything. So let's work on that now. So for completed to-dos, as in we are completing a to-do, we want to be looking at this to-do right here, which handles the button, checkbox, etc. And what we want to do is add an onChange here that's currently in console.log and make that query make more sense. So we need to complete something called complete to-dos, and this query for complete to-dos is going to take the UUID and pass that along and say, hey, this one primary key, I'm going to set it to true and return the ID to us. So I'm going to write this query out again just using this, because I think it's important to not always rely on using the GraphQL client, but if you prefer to do that, go right ahead. So this query here, complete to do, is going to be based upon the fact that we have the ability in GraphQL and in Hasura, more specifically, there is an option to complete by update to-dos by a primary key, similar to this delete by primary key. So we can do this mutation here, and we can call it complete to do, and we're going to pass in ID here and set that equal to nothing. So we're just going to set UUID equals empty string. And that might seem a bit weird, but it will all make sense in a second. And then we're going to update to-dos by PK, and then PK underscore columns, and set ID to $ID. So we're going to pass in the ID, then a comma here, and then we're going to use the word set and tell it what we're going to set. So I'm going to set the completed column to true. And then all I need is the return. So you always need to return at least one thing. So we'll return an ID. And that's it. So now we have this functionality here that takes a primary key and passes it along. So what we need to do now is take this and actually use it in our to-do section. And the way that this works, it seems a bit strange, but it'll all make sense in a second. So in here, we need to import the same things we've imported a few times. So we're going to use mutation from @Apollo client. And we're going to import complete to do and get to dos from our queries. So it is //lib/queries. And then what we're going to do inside of here is say const complete to do mutation is set equal to use mutation, and then we're going to use the mutation and we're going to set it to complete underscore to do. Then to complete this, we're going to say const complete to do equal to E, and then E dot prevent default, and then complete to do mutation. So complete to mutation, and then variables, we're going to pass in ID, comma, to do.id. We'll also tell it it's an optimistic response again. So optimistic response set to true. Update cache. So the same kind of thing we did before. And we're even going to use the same exact queries we did for this delete. We're going to say we want to get this. And if it doesn't equal the to-do ID, we'll set it to that. So we can copy this and we can actually use it in our to-do here and say everything here, except from this value, we need to change to to-do.id. And then that will give us the query back. Then we can hit save, and then we need to use this complete to do. So we can just change this on change to complete to do. And that's it. Now, in theory, we should be able to complete something and it will automatically update immediately. So let's see if that works. So here we have 2, and I think I'm going to check this one off. So let's click it, and it's immediately gone from the screen. And in theory, it should be updated in our Explorer. So if we go here, go to our data section, and go to our to-dos table, and look at this testing 1, 2, 3, it is set to true. So we know that this one is completed now, and the only one that's going to get returned is this James's course is great. So much information. So we are literally this close to finishing the project before we're ready to deploy it. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to create our completed table to show actually completed projects. So let's do that now. So let's start first with a query. We have a get Todos query where we set this to false. Well, we could just do another one of these and set it equal to true and return the same information. So let's copy this down and set this to true. Change the name to get completed to-dos and set this to get completed to-dos. In case you ever want to run the query outside of here, hit save, and now we have this get completed to-dos. Now all we need to do is make this query similar to our query for to-dos so that we have something returned, and then we can iterate over that. So in our completed to-dos, we have this essentially a set of headings and then some TR and TDs. So first things first, we need to import use query. So import use query, and that's going to come from the Apollo client. So Apollo/client, and then import get completed to-dos from, you guessed it, /lib/queries. Now we just need to use this to fill out the data. So we can do const loading error data equal to use query get completed to-dos. If loading, return loading. If error, return div with the error. And now all that's left is essentially the last part here, which is returning the data as it's used. So what we need to do is in our sections where the T body is right here, we need to just make a quick few edits here. So because we made this UI beforehand and making it agnostic, it makes it really quick to update. We can just do data todos.map, and we can say to do, and for safety, we can do a couple of question marks here. so that we don't try and map something that doesn't exist. We can say to do, and then we can do an arrow, and then we can return the data inside. So we can take this and copy it and paste it in here and say, okay, well, how do we use all of this data here? So let's make sure this is all good. And then the key is going to be todo.id. This is the title. So this will be todo.title. This will be todo.note. And this one is going to be something special. Okay, so when we query it from the database, it's going to give you a date timestamp with the UTC on it, and we don't want that. So I can do new date todo.updated underscore at dot to locale date string, and that will format it for us so that we don't have some crazy mistakes in there. And that's it. That's the whole query. Very much an easy change here. Just one set of lines. So we should be able to look at this now, and it should be updating with our completed to-dos. And there we go. Test, can you hear me? The date is coming back as invalid. So let's check and see why that's happening. So in theory, this query should have... oh, that's the reason why. We forgot to put this as updated at. So hit save there, and then make it redo the query. And there we go. Now we have a date and the note and the title. So everything is done here. We have a home page that we can add new stuff to. We can say, cool notes, bro. Did you cut the lawn? Add note. And here it is. And then I can check it off. And then it shows up immediately over here. And I can check this one off, and it will show up over here. So we got everything done now. The most important part now is deployment. So if you're interested in learning how to deploy this for sale and then into production, check out the last video, which tells you how to deploy this whole project to production.